Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guests this week are Brielle Morgan and Emilee Gilpin. Both Brielle and Emilee are editors with IndigiNews, a partnership between APTN and the Discourse dedicated to covering the news in a way that allows for Indigenous stories to be heard, understood, and respected. Brielle, Emilee, thanks so much for being with us on the show this week.
Hello, thanks for
having us, Dennis.
Emilee, let's start with you, maybe a little on how and why did you get into journalism?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think like other journalists, I love a good story. I grew up hearing great stories, but I also understood the importance of telling the truth. And I didn't always see that reflected in the media. Once I started really tapping in and paying attention, I saw how there could be misinformation shared. I started studying about the history of newspapers in Canada and how certain voices and peoples and stories have been left out or misrepresented. So I wanted to see if I could learn about, what it takes to be a journalist, and if I could, engage in that space and share stories in a good way.
Brielle, what drew you into journalism?
I think it was a combination of, I felt like it was a way for me to use the skills that I'd always felt that I had from a really early age. I loved writing. My favorite thing to do when my friends came over was read independently and write. And so that just stuck with me through the course of my life. And it wasn't until my late 20s or mid 20s that I thought this would be a great place for me to merge my interest in social issues and the skills that I had as a writer and a critical thinker.
Emilee, how would you describe IndigiNews and the importance of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think IndigiNews is really special. I think it's a seed that's been planted into the Canadian media landscape, one that continues to be watered and nurtured and will continue to grow. And it's an example of independent media that's doing things differently, sharing community-based stories with a really high ethical standard of how we practice journalism. So relationship-based reporting, trauma-informed reporting, anti-oppressive reporting. And we've been a small but mighty team. We've made, quite big waves with, the little ripples that we've had to start with. So I think we're a necessary media outlet that is really changing the game.
Brielle, how did you become involved with IndigiNews, and how important do you feel it is to have a news source like this out there?
I think it's so important. I became involved because I had worked for the Discourse, and as you mentioned, IndigiNews was initiated by APTN and the Discourse together, and so I'd been working mostly as a reporter for the Discourse for a few years prior to joining the IndigiNews team, and I'd been focusing on the so-called child welfare system. And I came back from maternity leave at a time when IndigiNews had just hired Anna McKenzie, free reporter who was focused on the child welfare system, and they asked me if I could support her in that role as an editor, and so I was just doing some part-time work, and then I joined the team in January in a more full-time way to work sort of as a coach and an editor with the reporters.
Brielle, have there been stories, do you think, that you've been able to share that you don't think you would have been able to at another news outlet?
Yeah, definitely. All the community-based stories that Kelsey Kalana in particular is doing, I think we make a lot of space in our newsroom for challenging the status quo way of reporting, centering Indigenous language, Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and pushing back against CP style in a lot of ways. So I think our process and our style is a lot different than it is in other newsrooms. As for the kinds of stories we tell, I think that we move really slowly, and especially when it comes to covering the so-called child welfare system, building relationships and building trust with families, with parents, with young people that have been directly impacted by the system takes a lot of time, takes a lot of care. and we make sure to apply trauma-informed practices in the way that we work with these families. And I think that in the hustle and bustle of a lot of newsrooms, that there just isn't the time for that.
Absolutely, and you touched on some things we're going to touch on in a little bit. But Emilee, you know, you've been in other newsrooms. Do you feel that IndigiNews is getting out stories that you might not have been able to tell in another newsroom?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it has to do with the relationships that we all have in the newsroom. Our team has changed quite a bit. We were having, 7 full-time reporters, and then it shifted to be a smaller number as we try and sort out this, revenue model that all independent media outlets are trying to sort out, really. But, every reporter, mostly mixed Indigenous women and non-gender conforming folks and mothers and family members, aunties, have brought all of their relationships and communities into the newsroom. So we're hearing about stories that you really don't know about unless you have those relationships. And we have a really high standard of trust in our newsroom. So the people that come to us with their stories, or the folks that we're talking to, they have a trust because we're so clear about our intentions and our process. We have a understanding of some of the ongoing historical and political landscape, social landscape, legal landscape. So I think that means a lot when we're dealing with our sources and interviews and that sort of thing.
Emilee, one of the goals of IndigiNews is to debunk stereotypes about Indigenous communities perpetrated by mainstream media. Can you tell us some of the ways that that is being done?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of that has to do with some of the internal conversations in newsrooms. So one of our, practices is that we really look at the intention. So when, someone pitches a story or a story is offered to us, one of the first questions we ask is like, what is the intention of this story, either with the person who's brought it forward or us ourselves pursuing it. And if we find that the intention is to, let's say, get more subscribers, get lots of likes, get lots of clicks, win an award, then that story can be mishandled really easily. But if we're clear that our intention is to share the truth, hold power to account, report really accurately and to be held accountable in the process, then that's an entirely different experience as well. So in some ways, it's instating a new culture into the journalism, field itself, because that culture of journalism that we know today, although it has changed in great amounts in this country, it did come from a colonial history. So there were still practices of extractivism, of trauma porn, of sensationalism, and of misinformation that perpetuated harmful stereotypes of Indigenous peoples, either through homogenizing people when there is, as you know, such a diversity of peoples, cultures, and communities from coast to coast to coast, to outright harmful stereotypes of people.
Brielle, IndigiNews is focused very much on the West Coast. How would you describe the news in that area prior to IndigiNews? Was it a bit of a news desert for this type of storytelling?
I think that the two areas that we're really focused on right now, which are serving Indigenous folks in the Okanagan region and also telling stories about the child welfare system and education as they're relevant to Indigenous folks, particularly on Vancouver Island, were really underserved areas. There wasn't a lot of community-driven, community-based reporting coming out of the Okanagan the way that Kelsey Kalana is doing it. And I think that as testament to that, she gets a lot of calls from community members with concerns about other media outlets and the way that they're covering certain stories. She gets calls from journalists asking for connections to communities and asking for her advice on how to approach a story in a trauma-informed way. And so that's been a real, Kelsey's had to put a lot of energy into serving both community members and other journalists in that way. And I think when it comes to the child welfare system across the country, there's just not enough newsrooms giving the time and space that we need to really honor the families and look deeply at the transition from from power being concentrated in the provinces and the territories and making that transition back to Indigenous communities. There's just not enough resources being spent on covering that, I feel like.
Absolutely. Well, the team from IndigiNews was providing their advice the last few days. We're going to talk about that and reporting on the child welfare system. We just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with IndigiNews reporters Emilee Gilpin and Brielle Morgan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guests this week are Brielle Morgan and Emilee Gilpin. They are reporters and editors with IndigiNews, which is dedicated to covering the news in a way that allows for Indigenous stories to be heard, understood, and respected. Brielle, a lot of your reporting has focused on the child welfare system. Why is that something that you're so passionate about?
Well, about 5 years ago when I was working with the Discourse, I just kind of randomly attended an event here in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in Vancouver. And it was focused on outcomes for young people who were transitioning out of the so-called child welfare system, all the things that they were up against. And I remember hearing from folks at that event that media was something they felt they were up against as opposed to something that was serving them. And so I started talking to people about that and asking them for coffees and hearing over and over again that people were really frustrated with the simplistic narratives around the so-called child welfare or foster care, that they felt the voices of Indigenous people in particular and families weren't being heard, their stories weren't being told. And when they were being told, they were doing so, they were being told in a way that wasn't responsible and wasn't representative. And so, yeah, as a non-Indigenous person who didn't have lived experience in that system, I questioned whether I had a place in that space and was told again and again that I have an opportunity as a journalist to leverage the education that I have, the resources that we have as a newsroom, to try and dig deeper and work with families and with communities to tell some of the stories that weren't being told.
Brielle, you keep referring to it as the so-called child welfare system. You know, we have people who call it the millennial scoop, a number of different things. What do you think more accurately describes the system?
Oh, that's a great question. I haven't actually thought of an alternative. I just like to use cheeky question marks around it. I don't really know.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Don't want to put you on the spot. I mean, we do hear a lot of different ways to describe it. Related to that, Brielle, what would be some of your concerns with the way in which stories on the child welfare system are typically told?
Well, I feel like we're missing the big picture so often. I think that there's a really interesting transformation, a really important transformation happening right now across the country with different nations and communities reclaiming jurisdiction over their child welfare, their so-called child welfare systems, over child and family services. And I feel like there's so much important historical context that needs to be included when you tell stories about this kind of transformation of power. And I feel like most newsrooms aren't really equipped to tell those stories or are intimidated to tell those stories because of the complexity. And because so many journalists are non-Indigenous, so many journalists don't have lived experience in that space, and they don't have those relationships within community to really stand with people and work with them to tell their stories about what's going on.
I think we've all done a lot of reporting, and I mean the three of us on the child welfare system, and every newsroom could likely have a reporter just dedicated to that full time. Sometimes it feels like things are finally changing, like not housing kids in hotels or the ending of the practice of birth alerts, although we're finding out that may not have ended in some provinces. Brielle, do you have faith that the system is changing or can change?
Yeah, I mean, I look at the youth on the ground in BC here. I look at organizations like Fostering Change. I look at some of the youth that have worked in the newsroom at the Discourse as young people with lived experience who are interested in learning more about journalism because they see the power that media has to put pressure on people in colonial systems to really listen to community and take action. And I'm continually inspired and encouraged by the work that's like the youth-led work that's happening on the ground. I look at Cindy Blackstock. I'm waiting for the federal government to confirm whether or not they're going to keep digging their heels in and fighting the compensation order. And I think that there are so many strong advocates out there raising the level of consciousness around the system. So yeah, I'm confident that things are changing.
This is going to air in just a couple of days, but I don't think any of us here will be surprised if the government does file the appeal. Emilee, IndigiNews just wrapped up 3 days of journalism training. There was a whole forum on trauma-informed reporting. Can you tell our viewers first what trauma-informed reporting is and why you think it's so critical?
Yeah, just to give you a little bit of background there, we hired a new reporter on our team who is the child welfare education reporter based on Vancouver Island. And we thought it was, my bright idea, but kind of risky idea let's open up the training. We need to train this new reporter, not just in, actual journalism training and strengthen their knowledge, but also in the way that we do things. So we needed to have a session on anti-oppressive reporting and trauma-informed reporting, which pretty much is being trauma-informed in your work, avoiding causing more harm to people who are experiencing trauma, have experienced trauma, really understanding the importance of process in the work so that you're not causing harm to people, especially in the communities and spaces that we are, reporting on. So we decided to open it up to the public and, kind of gently put it out there and said, look, we're going to be doing 3 days of training. If anyone's interested in these subjects, it's free and accessible and inclusive. And we had over 400 people sign up, wow, which to us showed us that people wanted to do things better. So there was a mix of attendees who are seasoned journalists in many different areas who wanted to know about trauma-informed reporting. Maybe they've gotten criticism or pushback on some of the reporting that they've done. Maybe they were feeling, the responsibility from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions to the media specifically to be more accountable. Or maybe it was new storytellers. There was also, a large amount of Indigenous peoples who wanted to share their own stories. They wanted to learn about how to pitch a story, the interviewing process, what balanced reporting means, how to write a story from a news release and really amplify the voices of their own communities. So we were just so blown away that there was over 400 people that signed up, over, 100 people in each session. And yeah, we had really meaningful conversations around all of these topics.
Yeah, incredible to get that many people, and I'm going to come back to the forum, but just want to ask Emilee, are there things in place for yourselves, the other reporters at IndigiNews, in terms of aftercare for the reporters telling these stories?
We do our best, we do our best to really take care of ourselves. One of the major funding that we get is through the Local Journalism Initiative, which is, of course, a federal funding agency, and through that, we have specific mandates and quota. So one of the most difficult parts has been trying to meet those mandates of, 3 to 6 stories a week for a certain beat, while at the same time practice the kind of reporting in the ethical way that we are talking about today. So, we've done our best as a team. We are a team of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and we divide that labor very intentionally and very accordingly. Some of our reporters have been surviving the news of this past summer of the ongoing uncoverings of bodies on the so-called residential schools or assimilation institutions, while also surviving wildfires and unprecedented climate change. And then, of course, this ever-shifting global pandemic. So it's been very difficult, but the fact is we're not like the journalism, the newsrooms that you see in Hollywood where people have, 7 coffees and 2 cigarettes and sleep at the desk. And we drink a lot of coffee for sure, don't get me wrong, but we value our well-being. We check in every single morning, every day. We support each other with a story. It's not one person going out. So we really have a different culture in our newsroom, and that's so important for caring for the people who share their stories with us. That's a high responsibility. We each believe that we're in this work because we're upholding our responsibilities to tell the truth, to share stories, and to, care for them in the process, not exploit people, traumatize people in the process of the work.
Well, I can tell you 16 years in daily news for myself. I've had many, multiple coffee, multiple cigarettes at the same time days. More to talk about here. We're just going to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with IndigiNews reporters Emilee Gilpin and Brielle Morgan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guests this week are Brielle Morgan and Emilee Gilpin. They are reporters and editors with IndigiNews, which is dedicated to covering the news in a way that allows for Indigenous stories to be heard, understood, and respected. And Brielle, maybe let's start with you. Have you seen changes in journalism, the stories that we're hearing, the people who are telling them since you got into the business?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that newsrooms are under a lot of pressure to really diversify their news teams. I think we're seeing a lot more space intentionally being made for BIPOC folks, for Indigenous folks, for non-gender conforming people, and I'm really, really encouraged by that. And I think when it comes to covering the child welfare system, I'm encouraged by the number of journalists in my network who are genuinely interested in learning how to report on the system in a more trauma-informed way, and working together as journalists from different newsrooms, sitting down with community members directly and coming up with ideas for stories and investigations together. So I think there's a lot of appetite for sort of doing away with hierarchies and figuring out ways to work more collaboratively with community members and across newsrooms.
I love that. That's why IndigiNews is so great, this collaboration. Emilee, going back to the journalism workshop that IndigiNews just held, that focused in part on decolonizing journalism. Like you said, 400 plus people signed up for that and took part. How do you feel about the future of journalism following that?
I feel excited. Yeah, I feel excited. I think there are a lot of new storytellers, up and coming, emerging journalists that are equipped with more knowledge. Knowledge is power. And although it feels like it can be really slow times trying to really have accurate education out there in this country, it's happening. And the media has a huge responsibility to play in that, in sharing accurate information, true information. We know that we need truth before we can have any kind of reconciliation. So I think that is happening. I think people genuinely want to know what has taken place. They want to know what continues to go on. They want to know their role in it, how they're situated in this whole thing. And they want to know, how that then charges them to do differently or do better. So what each of our own individual responsibilities are, as well as our collective. So I'm excited, and I think there's a lot of youth as well who have all different kind of creative tools for storytelling, whether it's on social media, animation, photo, video. I think we're going to see in this shifting landscape of media really creative ways of storytelling, and in some ways, some of those old traditions coming forward.
Well, I think that's a positive way to end the show. Brielle, Emilee, thank you both so much for the work that you do and for being on the show this week.
Thanks so much for having us, Dennis.
And a shout out to Anna and Kelsey too, and the whole IndigiNews team for all the work that they're doing. That is all the time we have for this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. This show and each and every episode of Face to Face is also available as a podcast. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.